Oh, God. Oh.
In the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, Meg Ryan became the face of a very specific kind of Hollywood magic. She wasn't just a successful actress, she was the embodiment of the modern romantic comedy. For nearly a decade, if a studio wanted to make a love story that felt charming, accessible, and guaranteed to connect with audiences, there was one obvious choice. Her smile, her timing, and her ability to balance humor with vulnerability turned her into something rarer than a hitmaker, a cultural fixture. At her peak, Meg Ryan wasn't simply starring in popular films, she was shaping how an entire genre looked, felt, and sounded. Margaret Mary Emily Ann Hyra was born in 1961 in Fairfield, Connecticut, and raised in a middle-class Irish Catholic family. Her mother was a casting director and acting teacher, and her father was a teacher, which meant she grew up around the idea of performance, even if stardom itself wasn't the plan. She attended the University of Connecticut and later transferred to New York University, where she studied journalism. Acting began less as a calling and more as a practical decision. She took small roles in commercials and television to help pay for school. One of her earliest regular jobs was on the soap opera As the World Turns, where she worked in the early 1980s. It was typical, unglamorous working actor experience, but it taught her how sets functioned, how cameras worked, and how to perform consistently under pressure. Her early film roles were small and unassuming. She appeared briefly in Top Gun in 1986 as the wife of Anthony Edwards' character, a part that hardly suggested future stardom, but placed her inside one of the biggest movies of the decade. The real turning point came in 1987 with Inner Space, a science fiction comedy where she starred opposite Dennis Quaid, who would later become her husband. The film wasn't just a showcase for special effects, it revealed something important about Ryan. She had a screen presence that felt natural and unforced. She could be funny without seeming like she was trying to be, and she could be warm without appearing calculated. Hollywood notices those things quickly. The true breakout arrived in 1989 with When Harry Met Sally. The film, written by Nora Ephron and directed by Rob Reiner, became a cultural landmark almost immediately. Ryan's performance as Sally wasn't just charming, it was specific. She played a woman who was particular, anxious, sincere, and gradually more open as the story unfolded. The famous diner scene became one of the most quoted moments in romantic comedy history, but the film worked because of something more subtle. Audiences believed her. She felt like someone you could actually meet, not a distant movie star. The movie was a major success, and almost overnight, Meg Ryan became a leading lady. What followed was one of the most impressive runs in any actor's career, especially within a single genre. In the early 1990s, she began stacking hits in a way that made her name synonymous with romance and comedy. Joe vs. the Volcano in 1990 didn't become a classic, but it paired her with Tom Hanks for the first time, a collaboration that would define both of their careers. In 1993, Sleepless in Seattle turned that pairing into something special. The film was a massive box office success and cemented Ryan as America's romantic ideal. She wasn't just playing love interests, she was becoming the standard by which romantic leads were measured. Then came When a Man Loves a Woman in 1994, which showed a different side of her. The film was more serious, more dramatic, and more emotionally raw. Ryan played a woman struggling with alcoholism, and the performance proved that she could carry heavier material without losing the audience's sympathy. That same year, she starred in IQ, returning to lighter territory, which only reinforced how flexible her screen persona was. By the mid-1990s, she wasn't just a rom-com star, she was a bankable leading actress with range, or at least the promise of it. In 1998, she reunited with Tom Hanks for You've Got Mail, a modern romantic comedy built around the early days of internet culture. The film was a major success and effectively closed the circle that When Harry Met Sally had opened nearly a decade earlier. By this point, Meg Ryan was more than an actress. She was a brand. Her name on a poster told audiences exactly what kind of experience they were going to get: warmth, humor, emotional sincerity, and a safe, satisfying ending. Studios loved that kind of reliability. Audiences did too. Throughout this period, she became a constant presence in magazines, talk shows, and award ceremonies. The media often referred to her as America's sweetheart, a label that both helped and quietly limited her. It placed her on a pedestal that was built almost entirely out of a specific image: approachable, just kind, slightly quirky, and emotionally open. That image was powerful. It sold tickets, but it also started to define the boundaries of what people expected her to be. By the end of the 1990s, Meg Ryan had achieved something very few actors ever do. She had become inseparable from an entire genre. Romantic comedies in that era were not just popular, they were often built around her presence. She was one of the highest paid actresses in Hollywood, consistently opening films and consistently delivering results. On the surface, it looked like an ideal career, steady success, cultural relevance, and a public image that seemed almost universally positive. But that same image, the one that made her so powerful in the first place, was also quietly turning into a cage. The industry had learned exactly how to use Meg Ryan, and audiences had learned exactly what to expect from her. And as her career moved toward the end of the decade, she began to face the same question that eventually confronts every star who becomes too closely associated with one thing. What happens when you try to become something else? By the time she reached the absolute peak of her fame, the conditions for a dramatic shift were already in place. The audience's expectations were fixed. The industry's marketing machine was rigid, and Meg Ryan, after a decade of playing variations of the same beloved role, was approaching the moment where she would try to step outside the image that had made her famous. That decision and the way the world reacted to it would change everything. By the end of the 1990s, Z's Meg Ryan was in a position that many actors would envy and quietly fear at the same time. She was one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, consistently associated with warmth, charm, and romantic optimism. But she was also very clearly boxed in. The roles that came her way were increasingly similar. The expectations from studios and audiences were firmly set, and like many actors who reached that kind of symbolic status, she began to feel the limits of the persona that had made her famous. The first signs of this shift came not through scandal or controversy, but through creative choices. In 2000, she starred in Hanging Up, a drama directed by Diane Keaton, alongside Keaton and Lisa Kudrow. The film was more subdued, more introspective, and more focused on family dynamics than romance. It wasn't a failure, but it also wasn't a cultural event. It was a small step away from the familiar path, and it suggested that Ryan was starting to look for something different, even if the transition was cautious. The much bigger statement came later that same year with Proof of Life, a political thriller in which she starred opposite Russell Crowe. This was not a romantic comedy, not a light drama, and not a role designed to reinforce her familiar image. The film itself received mixed reactions, but it generated enormous media attention for reasons that had little to do with its story. During production, Ryan's marriage to Dennis Quaid ended, and her relationship with Crowe became public. The narrative around her shifted almost overnight. For years, she had been treated as a symbol of wholesome, approachable romance. Now, she was suddenly at the center of a tabloid storm. This was a crucial moment, not because of the personal details themselves, but because of how they collided with the image Hollywood and the audience had built around her. Male stars had survived and often thrived through similar or far more extreme scandals, but Meg Ryan's career had been constructed on a very specific emotional contract with the public. She wasn't just a movie star, she was supposed to represent a certain idea of sincerity and innocence. When that illusion cracked, the reaction was disproportionately harsh. In 2001, she made what was arguably the boldest and most controversial choice of her career, starring in The Cut, an erotic thriller directed by Jane Campion. The film was dark, explicit, and deliberately uncomfortable. It presented Ryan in a way that directly opposed everything audiences thought they knew about her. This wasn't a gentle attempt at reinvention. It was a full rejection of the America's sweetheart persona. The response was brutal. Critics were divided, but the public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. The issue wasn't simply whether the film worked or not. The issue was that many viewers seemed personally offended by the fact that Meg Ryan had chosen to play this kind of role at all. The performance was judged not just as acting, but as a violation of an unspoken agreement between star and audience. The box office numbers reflected that discomfort. The film failed commercially, and the narrative around Ryan shifted again, this time in a more damaging direction. Almost simultaneously, she appeared in Kate and Leopold, a romantic comedy that felt like an attempt to return to safer territory. But the timing worked against her. The cultural conversation had already changed. The contrast between the two films only emphasized the sense that her career was in an identity crisis. Instead Instead of being seen as a versatile actress trying to expand her range, she was increasingly portrayed as a star who had lost her way. In 2003, she appeared in the Cut had already done its damage, but another high-profile project deepened the perception that something was wrong. She starred in Against the Ropes, a boxing drama loosely based on the life of Jackie Callan. The film was a critical and commercial failure, and by this point, a pattern was becoming visible. The projects were riskier, the returns were smaller, and the cultural support that had once carried her from hit to hit was gone. At the same time, Hollywood itself was changing. The early 2000s marked a shift away from the kind of mid-budget, star-driven adult dramas and romantic comedies that had dominated the previous decade. Franchises, special effects spectacles, and youth-oriented blockbusters were becoming the industry's primary focus. The environment that had once been perfect for Meg Ryan's brand of stardom was disappearing. But even in that context, the speed of her fall from the top was striking. Only a few years earlier, her name alone could open a movie. Now her project struggled to find an audience. The media framing didn't help. Instead of treating this as a normal career transition in a changing industry, the story was often told as a kind of moral or personal downfall. The conversation became less about her work and more about her choices, her image, and her supposed missteps. In 2004, she starred in Against the Ropes and then took on fewer and fewer high-profile roles. The pattern was clear. The combination of a shifting industry, a damaged public image, and a series of commercial disappointments had broken the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable. She was no longer the default romantic lead. She was no longer a guaranteed draw. And in Hollywood, that kind of shift can happen very quickly and very quietly. What made this period especially difficult was that there was no single clean explanation. It wasn't just one bad movie. It wasn't just one scandal. It was a collision of expectations, timing, and the limits of an image that had been both a blessing and a trap. Meg Ryan had tried to evolve at the exact moment when the industry and the audience were least willing to follow her. By the mid-2000s, the question was no longer whether she would reclaim her old position at the top. That era was clearly over. The real question had become something else entirely. What does a star do after the spotlight moves on, especially when their entire career has been built around being at the center of it? And for Meg Ryan, the answer would not be another dramatic comeback, but something much quieter and more complicated. By the time Meg Ryan reached the mid-2000s, her career had entered a completely different phase from the one that made her famous. The rapid succession of hits, the cultural dominance, and the sense that she was an essential part of Hollywood's mainstream had all faded. Now, what remained was a working actress navigating an industry that no longer revolved around her image or her strengths. This wasn't a sudden disappearance, but a gradual retreat from the kind of visibility she once had. In 2007, she appeared in the Land of Women, a smaller, quieter drama where she played a woman dealing with illness and emotional distance. The film didn't attract much attention, but it was a clear signal of the direction her career was taking. These were not star vehicles. They were modest, character-driven projects with limited reach. 2 years later, she starred in and directed Serious Moonlight, marking her first effort behind the camera. The film received little attention and mixed reactions, but the move itself was revealing. She was no longer being positioned as an actress at the center of Hollywood's commercial machine. She was beginning to shape her own work on her own scale. In 2015, she directed Ithaca, a World War II era drama in which she also acted. This project was more personal and reflective than anything she had done during her years of mainstream stardom. It didn't signal a comeback, and it wasn't intended to. It confirmed something that had been gradually becoming clear. Meg Ryan had shifted away from chasing the kind of success that once defined her. Instead, she was choosing projects that aligned more closely with her own interests, even if they came without attention or commercial impact. There was a brief moment of renewed visibility in 2023 when she returned to romantic comedy territory with What Happens Later, a film she co-wrote, directed, and starred in alongside David Duchovny. The project was openly framed as a mature, reflective take on the genre that had made her famous. It wasn't an attempt to recreate the 1990s. It was an acknowledgement that both she and the audience had changed. The film's reception was modest, but its existence was significant. It showed that she wasn't rejecting her legacy, but she also wasn't trying to live inside it. Looking back, it's clear that Meg Ryan's story is not simply about a star who fell from grace or made a few bad choices. It's about how tightly Hollywood binds certain actors to certain images and what happens when those actors try to step outside of them. In the 1990s, her appeal was built on a very specific emotional promise. She represented comfort, optimism, and a kind of approachable romance that audiences trusted. That trust was powerful, but it was also fragile. When she chose roles that challenged that perception, the reaction was not neutral. It was personal. There is also an unavoidable industry context to her story. The kind of movies that made her a star, mid-budget, adult-oriented romantic comedies and dramas, gradually lost their central place in Hollywood's business model. As franchises, sequels, and effects-driven blockbusters took over, the space for that kind of stardom shrank. Even actors who never experienced public controversy found their opportunities narrowing. In that environment, a star whose image had already been complicated faced even steeper odds. It's also worth noting how differently similar career arcs have often been interpreted depending on gender. Male stars have frequently been allowed to age, to fail, to reinvent themselves repeatedly without having their entire public identity called into question. Meg Ryan's attempt to change her screen persona by contrast was treated by many as a kind of betrayal rather than a natural evolution. The backlash to In the Cut was not just about the film, it was about the discomfort of seeing a familiar symbol refuse to stay in its assigned role. Over time, that moment has been reevaluated by some critics and audiences, but the damage to her mainstream momentum had already been done. Hollywood as an industry rarely waits for reassessments. It moves on quickly, and it tends to do so quietly. There was no formal ending to Meg Ryan's reign as a top star. There was just a gradual absence of the kinds of roles and opportunities that once came automatically. And yet, when her career is viewed as a whole, it's difficult to call it a failure. For roughly a decade, she was one of the most influential and recognizable actresses in the world. She helped define a genre, shape the tone of an era of popular filmmaking, and left behind a body of work that is still widely watched and referenced. When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, and You've Got Mail are not just nostalgic artifacts, they are still treated as reference points for how romantic comedies are written, performed, and structured. Her later years in the industry look quieter by comparison, but they also look more controlled. She has avoided the cycle of forced comebacks and self-parody that traps many former stars. Instead, she has worked sporadically, directed when she wanted to, and largely stayed out of the kind of media spotlight that once defined her life. In a business that often equates visibility with relevance, that kind of choice can easily be misread as disappearance. Meg Ryan didn't stop being an actress because she was forgotten overnight. She stepped away from being a symbol at the exact moment when that symbol was becoming more of a burden than a benefit. Her story is less about collapse and more about what happens when a star outgrows the version of themselves that the world refuses to let go of. For a generation of audiences, she will always be the face of a certain kind of movie magic. Quick dialogue, emotional honesty, and the belief that connection is worth the risk. That legacy hasn't changed, even if the industry around it has. And in the end, that may be the most accurate way to understand what really happened. She wasn't erased, the era simply moved on, and she chose not to chase it.